So I thought what I would maybe start by doing is to just give you a little bit of a sense of my background and how I came to team science and collaboration. You heard from Paul my academic path, my scientific path forward, but how did I get introduced to this as an area of interest? So when I was recruited to the National Cancer Institute, I got recruited to one of the intramural programs. Is everybody familiar with the intramural programs at the NIH? No. Okay, so the intramural program is the program at NIH where there are scientists doing research in laboratories. So 85% of the money from the NIH goes to the extramural community to fund laboratories at institutions nationwide, but we actually have laboratories on the campus of the NIH. So if you're not aware of that, you should definitely look into that because we're always looking for talented investigators to come work in our research laboratories too. So part of my role and responsibility there was to launch scientific teams. So I put up here, I was recruited to the NIH, or to the NCI, right after the intramural program had merged the Division of Basic Sciences with the Division of Clinical Sciences. And this was really an important merger. It was about 10, well, it's probably about 13 or 14 years ago now. And this was very, very forward-thinking from the perspective of the National Cancer Institute, because really translational research really hadn't gotten that bump that it had needed in a lot of different places. And the basic scientists found it was very, very difficult to even find a doorway into the clinical sciences. So if the basic scientists had an idea and they wanted to explore it in a clinical setting, trying to find a clinician who was willing to even give them the time of day to explain their project to them was a real challenge. So one way to start breaking down the barriers was to merge the divisions, so they created the Center for Cancer Research. And then the second step that was taken is that the director had this great idea that we need to form faculties and working groups. We need to form groups that sort of cross-cut the organization, that bring really smart scientists together and challenge them to work on scientific problems as a team together that they wouldn't be able to solve in the laboratories by themselves. So they were of different flavors. They were of discipline-based, disease-based, scientific approach-based, and then areas of emerging scientific interest. And so one of my roles and responsibilities was helping to launch these teams, nurture these teams, be a den mother sometimes for these teams. And what I noticed is that some flourished, some failed, and some got really stagnant and just couldn't really move forward. So I actually started to become really interested in what was contributing to the success of these teams. Why were some teams able to move forward and others ended up getting stuck? So that's in large part what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So I found a collaborator at the NIH. So I was interested in successful team functioning, and my collaborator, Howard Gadlin, is actually the NIH ombudsman. Does everybody know what an ombudsman is? Kind of. So an ombudsman at an organization is the person you go to if you're having conflict with somebody else. You want to try to resolve it. You want somebody to be impartial. You want the conversations to be confidential, and it doesn't really go back to your supervisor. It's just it's a nice way to have your problem mediated by somebody else. So Howard oftentimes jokes that he runs an emergency room for failed scientific collaborations, because it's really when a team is in crisis that they come to him for help. So he was really interested in trying to figure out, how can I back up the process? How can I get people to not come to me for crisis? How can I give them some tools or some information that will enable them to take care of or nurture some of their collaborations on their own? And I was, again, interested from the more, how can I launch teams more successfully? So I should probably say, so we studied 5 different scientific teams. We studied 3 teams that we determined, or we kind of characterized as being successful. So what do I mean by that? I mean, they were able to take an idea from the laboratory bench and move it all the way into the clinical setting, in 2 cases through FDA approval. One of the teams failed miserably, and they were willing to talk to us about it, and then one team was in the process of forming. So through this research effort, we thought we did a pretty good job of uncovering what some of those critical features of successful team functioning are. And we decided, well, it would be good to share it with people, so we thought we'd write a little brochure, and the little brochure turned into the field guide, and the field guide is freely available as a PDF at teamscience.nih.gov. So if you want a copy, you can go there and grab it. But a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is in the field guide, and it's also, there are some pieces of it that are sort of extend beyond the field guide. We put this together in 2010, it seems just like yesterday, and we've learned a lot since then, so we'll probably think about coming out with a next version. So as we were doing this work and we were talking to people, people would often ask us, well, what do you mean scientific team? What is a scientific team? And we ended up coming up with an answer that is more of a hedge than a real firm answer in terms of what a team is. We sort of think about teams now on a continuum where at the very left-hand side you're at the low level of integration and interaction. And so an example of this might be somebody's first laboratory. So having your first laboratory, you might decide to set it up in a more team-based manner to work together as a group. But it's very focused, it's not very interactive outside of the laboratory. The middle level would be more like you might describe a research collaboration where you might be collaborating with somebody else. There's one set of samples, they have a technique, they run some experiments, they give you the results, you have results from other tests, you put it together, maybe you write a paper, and maybe you continue collaborating or not. So the types of teams that I was talking about, sort of these highly integrated and interactive research teams, those are the teams that we studied, and that's the information. The information I'll be sharing today is largely drawn from that. So being in a highly integrated research team is a little bit different because it really requires you to establish and form ways of communicating with each other that are successful. It requires building some trust, and I'm going to talk to you about trust. But one of the most interesting things, or I thought a very interesting thing about these research teams is what these research teams is they tend to spawn new ideas, new activities, new projects, and many, many times new leaders. Because usually you don't have enough people in the team to, or the co-leaders or the leaders who are currently leading, they don't have enough capacity to take on another component of the project. So you tend to see very junior people stepping up and taking on some really cool challenges and having that opportunity to be a leader in the context of the team effort as well. There is a science of team science. I would say it's an emerging area of science. The Science of Team Science just had their annual conference is it still June? It was earlier this month. It was the 10-year anniversary, I guess, of the Science of Team Science. So a lot of people out there studying team science. And so as some of the vocabulary that they use and I sort of align with is that there's sort of a continuum of disciplinary integration, so very similar to what I just showed you, but moving from unidisciplinary to multidisciplinary, so that's more like the collaboration I was talking about where you might have different pieces from different elements, to interdisciplinary where you've got people from different disciplines who are working together, to what we call transdisciplinary, where you really start to integrate even more, maybe some of the social aspects, some political aspects. It really takes it to another level. I've got a colleague named Holly Falk-Krasinski who always cracks me up because whenever she talks about this, she talks about it in the context of fruit. So unidisciplinary, sort of like an apple. Multidisciplinary is sort of like a fruit basket. Interdisciplinary is like a fruit salad. She's like, you still got the little components of fruit, but they're still distinct, but you can kind of taste little bits of fruit on the other pieces of fruit. And then she talks about transdisciplinary sort of being the smoothie. It's like, you know, you can still kind of taste the banana in it, but it's all mushed up, so if that helps you at all. And I probably don't do it as well as she does, but I always think it's kind of a nice way to think about it. So, so if we start at sort of the beginning, what do we need to be thinking about when we're launching a team? And this is, I think, work that a lot of people are interested in doing, and recognizing that people have been collaborating for a long, long time. So it's not really something new, but in a way, I think there's an increased interest in collaborative research. And so it's kind of fun to talk about, and fun to talk about to groups like this, so that if you're actually thinking about putting a team together, you can kind of think about what are those elements that are important to consider. So the first thing that I want to say, and I want to make sure is really clear, because parts of this are going to start sounding kind of fluffy to you probably. At least scientists kind of see parts of what I talk about as being fluffy and obvious, because they have to do with group dynamics. But when we talk about team science, the whole reason you're pulling a team together is the science, right? The science really sits at the center. You want everybody to be focused on the research project. But there are all these things that sort of surround the research project. There's things like trust and setting expectations, power, sharing credit, sharing resources, that if you're not tending to them, even as a participant on the team, can end up pulling people away from focusing on the science, because now you have to spend time focusing on the team dynamics or a disagreement, okay? So in terms of launching a team, there's actually data coming out, and this is sort of aligned now with the science of team science. How do team members find each other? So they did an experiment at Harvard that basically showed that face-to-face interaction is really important. The way they set up the experiment was they sent out biographical information to all of the people that they invited to participate in these symposia that they held on a couple of different days. They brought people to one symposium, and so they gave them chances to network and gave them breaks. But they further distilled the groups into smaller groups by putting them in just like poster discussion sessions. And then they had everybody aligned in the poster discussion groups so that they were near each other or further from each other. And they offered a carrot at the end of these symposia where they offered people like a small seed funding. So if you encourage people to submit something collaboratively, it had to be across disciplines. And then they took a look to see who actually submitted grants together. And what they showed is sending out biographical information about other people at the same institution didn't really make a difference. Bringing people together at the same symposium and having them there the same night for several hours with these breaks didn't make a difference. What made a difference is having them in the same room together for a defined period of time and having them actually in closer proximity in terms of where their posters are. And there's additional data that's coming out now that's showing face-to-face is really important for getting people together and finding collaborators. So I oftentimes think about team science as an exercise in increasing diversity. And because when you're bringing people together, one of the major things that you're interested in doing is bringing people in from different disciplines, right? So you might be a basic scientist, you want to collaborate with a clinician, you just realize that maybe a new device might be helpful, so you invite an engineer. So as you're bringing people together, you've got these different disciplines that you're thinking about. But there are a lot of other types of dimensions of diversity too. Expertise, methodology, approach, philosophy, background. And then there are things like gender and race and ethnicity and other types of dimensions of diversity that we need to think about too as we're pulling groups together. Is that right? Okay. So one of the things that I've learned over the last couple of years that I think is really interesting, and this is actually from work that's done by Scott Page, who's a mathematician by training, and he's also has a nice book out called The Difference, which is pretty interesting. But if you pull together a group of experts to work on a problem, that group of experts does not make an expert team. The group that performs better is actually a randomly selected group of people that you charge to work on the problem. Does that make sense to everybody? So a group of experts doesn't necessarily make an expert team. And so a lot of times we as scientists, kind of at these high levels, we say, well, we really have this important project, so we're going to pull together the best people in these areas and have them work together. And that might not be the best approach to actually getting the problem solved. There's a lot of data to show in the business world as well as in the scientific world that if you have women on teams, the teams are going to do better. I don't know if I need to say more. I could leave this here for another moment if you want to really, but it's quite gratifying actually for me. Ethnicity. There's been some studies to actually look at the ethnicity of groups. And the bottom line is that, I think the fourth bullet down, higher diversity is associated with publication in higher impact journals with a higher rate of citation. And this comes from work that's cited here at the bottom by Freeman and Wang. So, you know, the composition of teams, I think it's a very difficult thing to study, but people are trying to get in there and study it a little bit more carefully in terms of the ethnic, racial types of compositions. Gender's a little bit easier, but start moving in these areas. Here's a really nice example that I like to show, just because I think it makes a really, really good point. And that the bottom line is, you know, who should you be inviting to participate on your team? And sometimes you think you know in advance who you need on your team, but stepping back to reflect on that as the project progresses can be really valuable.
Oh, this is using the video tracking software.
All right.
Explain.
My coworker Wanda and I are sitting in front of an HP Media Smart computer. State-of-the-art computer, wouldn't you say?
I'd say.
We're using the face tracking software, so it's supposed to follow me as I move. I'm black. I think my blackness is interfering with the computer's ability to follow me. As you can see, I do this, no following. Not really following me. I back up. I get really, really close to try to let the camera recognize me. Not happening. Now, my white coworker, Wanda, is about to slide in the frame. You will immediately see what I'm talking about. Wanda, if you would, please.
Sure.
Now, as you can see, the camera is panning to show Wanda's face. It's following her around. But as soon as my blackness enters the frame, which I will sneak into the frame. I'm sneaking in, I'm in there.
That's it.
And there we go, it stopped. My hands are here. Wanda, please get back in the frame. Get back in. As soon as white Wanda appears, the camera moves. Black Desi gets in there. Oh, nope. No face recognition anymore, buddy. I'm going on record. And I'm saying it. Hewlett-Packard computers are racist. I said it.
So it might not surprise you if I tell you that that went viral. Maybe you didn't see it, but a lot of people did, including Hewlett-Packard. And if you go and Google this, there's a whole bunch of entries. Hewlett-Packard made their own videos. They were justifying why this might be the case. But they did put a team on it, and the team was focused on trying to correct the problem, and in the end they did, and you can find that whole story online as well. So I don't think I really need to go in a lot of detail, but again, you know, thinking about who's on your team and the goal of the project can be well worth your time and effort. One of the things that we also learned is that in building a team and putting a team together, the team can be formed in a lot of different ways. There can be somebody in the organization of the organization, a leader who says, you know what, I want to put a team together to work on X or to work on Y. Or maybe it's a group of people or a group of students who get together and say, you know, we've got this great idea for a project and we want to work together. The critical elements of that are that at the organization you really need to have top-down support, really need to have the leadership agree and believe in team science and collaboration as something that's valuable. And for some people in the audience, you might be thinking, you must be joking. Of course it's valuable. But there are a number of people out there who really are very, very focused on investigator-initiated research and aren't as big of supporters of collaborations as you might hope that they would be. And then bottom-up engagement is very important too. So learning to work together. And this is where, you know, there will be some things that might sound a little bit fluffy. but that's okay. You know, there's a lot of opportunity in working together in a team, and I sort of alluded to it. And that is the whole reason for having a team of people, is that you have new perspectives, new approaches, different ways of thinking, different disciplines. You come together to solve a problem, again, that you couldn't do on your own. But teams all face obstacles, and some of those obstacles are listed here. Different paradigmatic or operating assumptions, framed stereotypes, lack of recognition of other people's expertise, institutional disincentives, mistrust, lack of process, and all of these things can lead to things like conflict and misunderstanding and even dismissal of each other's views. So collaboration really can introduce threats, and the major threats that I see revolve around status, power, and autonomy. And so status obviously is something that's conferred by other people and when they think about you, and people get very concerned about their status. I want to be seen as the leading expert in the world. I want other people to recognize me as that expert. And so if I'm working interdependently with a bunch of other people, with a bunch of other team science people, maybe somebody wouldn't recognize me as being the expert, and that can be threatening for some people. It probably, you know, I don't know if any of you have met scientists with really big egos. I've met a few, and that can be really challenging for somebody to have to sort of step out of that and be willing to be co-recognized or to be part of a group. Power, so my power, I have to start sharing power if I want to be working in a team. I can't work autonomously. I need to be working with other people, decision making, all that comes into play. So sort of we have to think about moving from self-identity to a group identity and from independent to interdependent. So again, that can be a challenge for some people. I wanted to touch briefly on this model for team development, and I talked with one of the groups yesterday about this, probably more than they really wanted, but it seemed interesting and appropriate at the time. But there's this guy named Bruce Tuckman who in the 1960s studied a number of teams, scientific teams among them, and really broke down the phases of team development into 4 major phases. I'll just talk about 4 of them. And they rhyme, which is really nice, because then tonight at the end of the day you'll be able to remember them and share them with the people, you know, your friends over a drink or something. But they are forming, storming, norming, and performing. So forming I've already talked about a little bit, so this is when the team comes together. The storming period is the next period, and this is a stage that the group has to go through. It's the stage where roles and responsibilities haven't been defined yet, so people aren't really sure how they fit in. I sometimes think of it as the big elbows kind of coming out, you know, it's like, it's careful, this is my turf, don't get too close, people are protective, people don't really know how each other's communication styles are or their conflict styles are. So it's really a time where people are trying to define those types of things, expectations, roles, responsibilities. What kind of person are you really? Can I trust you? Can you trust me? Things like that. The next stage, if you get through storming, you can go into norming. And norming is where all of the norms of the group start to get set. And so the trust is building, we know how to work together, the roles and responsibilities are clarified, and that enables us to move into the performing stage. So the performing stage is when it's like the well-oiled machine. I mean, things are really humming, things are really going. So again, the storming phase is absolutely necessary. If the team does not get through storming, they're not going to go into norming. It'll remain superficial. People won't be able to operate in an environment of trust. They won't be able to talk to each other openly and honestly, to challenge each other's assumptions or results, things like that. And a last comment, if anybody joins the team or leaves the team, they will go through another round of storming. So I actually came across this paper where they talked a lot about how they worked together as a team and how they formed the team. And this was just a quote that I just pulled right out of the paper. We felt we had built up a better understanding by clarifying, justifying, and arguing. So they sort of talked explicitly about the process of storming, and that it does take some time to get through it. But if you're willing to spend the time to get through it and you bring it out as an explicit activity that the group is going to go through, the team is going to go through, it gives you a framework of having some conversations that might otherwise be either difficult to have or you're not able to give the storming phase a vocabulary word or a way of describing it. So what contributes to this storming phase? There's a number of things. One of them is psychological safety. If I'm in a group and I don't feel safe speaking up, if I don't feel safe speaking my mind, I won't. And then you lose because I'm not giving you my great ideas, right? So I don't know. I mean, I can think of a lot of meetings where I've been in where there's been one person who sort of dominates the meeting, very, controlling over what happens, and then there's usually a couple people that sort of sit through the whole meeting and never say anything, right? So you're not getting the best from that group, and so kind of making environments that are safe are important. Lack of a sense of belonging, imposter phenomenon, stereotype threat, and language as a barrier is one of the number of the things that come in. And so I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'll talk about a couple. So barrier to speaking up, psychological safety. So there's this woman by the name of Amy Edmondson who's done a lot of work around trust and about the ability to speak up. So one of the studies she did is she actually studied a number of surgical teams and how well they adapt to being able to do a new procedure with a new piece of instrumentation. And in those teams, the teams that adopted that technology fastest were the teams where the nurses were able to question the doctors, where the technicians were able to question people in higher authority and say, wait a second, I don't think you're doing that right. Whereas the teams that adopted the technology more slowly were those teams where the hierarchy was preserved, where you didn't dare question what the surgeon was doing. And so why don't people speak up? There's a lot of words on this slide, but basically it boils down to self-preservation. People feel like it's a risk to speak up, and maybe it's better if I just keep my mouth shut. And again, that's not advantageous to the team as a whole, because presumably you've invited everybody there for a reason, and so if not everybody has a chance to speak up, you lose, right? Language. Language is also an important element of working in a team. And when we work across disciplines, we speak different disciplinary languages.
I have a study, and I need to know how many patients I need. I think I only need 3 patients.
Okay, what kind of study is it?
I'm doing a lab study. Can I just use 3 patients?
That depends. What are you trying to show?
We always use 3 patients.
Okay, what are you trying to show?
I'm trying to show that drug A and drug B are better than only drug A.
How are you measuring if it is better?
We are looking at apoptosis. Can we just use 3 patients?
What kind of measure of apoptosis? Do you know how variable that measure is?
We always use 3 patients. That is what we have published before.
3 patients per group or in total?
Yes.
Okay, let's try something different. What type of measure are you using? And is this an in vitro study? An in vivo mouse study?
It is an in vitro study of patient samples, and we are looking at measures of apoptosis after treatment with drug A and drug B versus drug A and control. And drug B alone.
Oh, how many groups are you analyzing altogether then?
My grant is due tomorrow. I just need to know if I can just use 3 patients per group.
Okay, well, you probably should have come to me earlier for help with this.
All I need you to do is tell me that 3 patients are okay.
So, it is not that easy. Your marker for apoptosis may have a large amount of variability associated with it that could make it difficult to ascertain differences based only on 3 patients per group. It also depends on what kind of outcomes you are looking at. Are you looking at normalized changes in expression levels from baseline? 3 patients may not be sufficient to detect differences in these expression levels between the different treatment groups.
I do not understand.
I'm saying that you may need more than 3 patients per group, but that I need more information to determine that.
The serine protease granzyme B is made in cytotoxic lymphocytes, where it is inactive due to the low pH of the storage granules. It is measured immediately upon delivery into target cell cytoplasms, where the pH is neutral. This is followed by cleavage of Pacas phase 3 by granzyme B in the target cell cytoplasm and the subsequent induction of apoptosis. All proteolytic events can be quantitated at the live single-cell level by flow cytometry and imaged by confocal microscopy.
I understand very little of what you just said. Maybe we should talk more about this.
I just need to know if 3 patients are enough. My grant is due tomorrow.
We will need to meet to better understand this before we can determine the appropriate sample size.
I can put you on my grant for 0.5% FTE. You can design and analyze the data later.
Do you really think that is enough to do the work?
Well, it may be less if it is awarded and the budget is cut.
Please go away.
So I've seen this video so many times, and I still think it's pretty funny. So what about words? So we tend not to question words with which we're already familiar. And words can have an everyday meaning as well as a discipline-specific meaning. And so having conversations with people can sometimes, you might not think you're confused, but you might be confused and not know you're confused. So spending time sort of getting to know the language of the other discipline can be pretty valuable. Something else about language that's sort of come out more recently too, that I've become more aware of, is that women oftentimes will use powerless language. And so here's a quote. I would just like to say that I may not know as much as some of the communication experts out there, but I feel that women undermine their credibility time and time again by using minimizing language. How should this really work? Women undermine their credibility time and time again by using minimizing language. And so powerful versus powerless language can be an interesting component of a team dynamic. So then I came across another paper that actually looked at powerful language and powerless language in the context of teams, in the context of status referral by team members. And it actually turns out that individuals who use powerful language are conferred more status when the tasks are more independent. So when the interdependence of the group was low. But when the interdependence of the group is high, powerless language actually results in higher status conferral. And so the way that the paper interpreted this is that powerless language suggests that the leader is more mindful of everybody's, sort of how everybody's doing in the group. So there's some interesting dynamics associated with that. But again, I think these are things that are interesting and to kind of be aware of. In terms of team science and collaborations, a bit of I guess a diversion from what I was talking about. But I wanted to make sure that I brought forward that, things have really changed, and I think a lot of people know that things are changing. So there never used to be co-first authors, right? And now we have co-first authors. I came across these couple of examples a year or so ago. So there was a Nature editorial early in January of 2013. It said, last year this journal received an unusual request. Could 3 authors have it indicated in a footnote that they were joint second authors on a paper? We refused. And then later that year in Nature, there was this letter that was published. And if you can see the authorship, it's really a consortium and another group. And so none of the authors were listed as there's no name as a first or last author. All the names are at the very end, is sort of the end of the paper, but they just kind of listed themselves as a group. And so things are sort of shifting and changing in terms of how we're looking at things. If we look at the number of co-first author manuscripts in the basic sciences, you can see that from 1990 to 2012, you see an uptick in all of them. And it's actually starting to be seen in now more of the clinical journals as well, that this idea of co-first authorship is acceptable. So a lot of what I've been talking about sort of in this section revolves around the concept that when you have a team that's working together, you want that team to get to the point where you can engage in what we call productive collision. So one thing I haven't said yet, but that is important to think about, is that conflict really drives science forward. It's important to be able to challenge people's assumptions, challenge the results, question how they're thinking about things, question their approach. And to have those conversations and be able to have those conversations openly and honestly is really critical. Because if you can't have those conversations, you're not going to be driving the science forward, right? But you want to be able to do so in a respectful way. So you want to minimize the chances that people might perceive something as a personal attack, right? And you want to maximize the abilities to have just a very open and honest conversation about the science itself. So I'm just going to share now a couple of what I consider to be the key features of working effectively together. One of them is shared vision. This goes back to the bubbles that I showed you with the science in the center. Being really, really clear as a leader or co-leaders of a team, what is the overall vision? Where do you want to go? What do you want to do? So why is this really important? It's important because people will decide to follow you based on your vision. Everybody's too busy these days, right? We all have too much to do. So where I decide to put my time depends on how excited I am about what's going on. And so if your vision is really compelling, I'll probably follow you. If you can't articulate to me what it is you really want to do, I don't know that I'm going to be quite as interested. So in those teams that we interviewed, we found at the very fundamental level, for those teams that were very successful, every person on the team was able to articulate the overall vision of the laboratory and able to articulate their role in the context of that overall team. Trust. Trust, I think I mentioned before, is imperative. Trust really ended up being much, much, much more important in this study than we thought it would be. And we knew it would be important, but it ends up being really important. So I've got a question for you. So when you meet somebody new in the work context, do you tend to be high trust? Do you a priori think you'd be able to trust the other person? Yes? No? Okay, so that's very similar to what I see at most times when I ask this question. It's about a 50-50 split. So look at the person next to you quickly and imagine that they're the opposite of you. And you're going to start talking, right? What if they're the opposite of you and you go in and you're a high trust person, you probably assume, of course, they'd be high trust too. But if they're not, that's going to kind of shift the dynamic. And you might not understand, why are they treating me like that? Well, they might be waiting for you to prove that you're trustworthy, right? So it's a good thing to kind of think about. When I talk about trust, I think more so a number of years ago than now, people used to get kind of uncomfortable. They'd roll their eyes at me. Trust, Michelle, that's really fluffy, hard to get my hands around. There's actually a huge literature on trust. If you take the time to read it, and I actually have read a lot of it. But one of the things that really emerges is that trust is not simple. It is actually fairly concrete, and there's different dimensions of trust. So one type of trust is this calculus-based trust, and the easiest way to think about calculus-based trust is when you take your car out on the road, right? You're going to trust that people are going to follow the rules of the road with you, right? So that's a very sort of fundamental, standard operating procedures in the laboratory, another type of calculus-based trust. There's competence-based trust. So that is my competence in somebody being able to do that experiment in the laboratory. So I think we all are familiar with the golden hand syndrome. We all know somebody just with golden hands, right? They seem to be able to get everything to work. And you come to really rely on them and have a lot of trust in their competence. The last type of trust on the slide is that identity-based trust. And this is the trust that your mind probably jumps to when I said trust initially. The trust, though, this trust is really reserved for very, very deep relationships. You know, family, really close friends, a spouse, a partner, a significant other. And it takes a long time to build. And you don't necessarily have to have identity-based trust in the work setting. So again, being mindful that there are different levels. Setting expectations is also really critically important. Knowing how to set the expectations, define roles and responsibilities, be clear about what people can expect of you and what you expect of them. So there's a couple of tools that I just wanted to bring to your attention, and both of them are available on that website, but I also have sent copies to Julie, and she could distribute them if you're interested. One is called the Welcome to My Team letter, and this was actually adapted from a Welcome to My Lab letter that a guy named Rich Mariah at the National Institute of Child Health and Development came up with. So Rich is in the Public Health Service, and he developed this letter. It's 8 pages long, and he gives this letter to everybody who's thinking of joining his laboratory. It very explicitly describes what he will expect of them if they come into the laboratory, and what they can expect of him. A number of people have sort of reacted negatively to the letter at the outset because it sort of sounds very, you know, I don't know, maybe like being in the Army or something, right? You know, a little bit militaristic. But we actually went out and talked to a number of people who received these letters, who are now PIs out there with their own labs, and almost all of them have their own letters. They found it to be that valuable. So, and I've got copies of the letters too, so if you're interested. And then the prenuptial agreement. So this really comes from a lot of work that Howard does. So Howard will often joke that there are no two people more foolish than people falling in love than people starting a scientific collaboration. That really sort of the romance, the bunny rabbits, the rainbows around that collaboration is just, you know, nothing could ever go wrong, right? And things do go wrong. And so he developed a template. So I talked about this already. And these are some of the elements on that template. It's available as an appendix in the field guide, and also Julie has copies of that too if you were to be interested. But really what it is that we provide about 18 questions to kind of get teams started. Questions that you can talk about. What's the vision? What's the purpose? When does the project end? What about credit? It forces the sort of collaborate. It forces you to have some of these conversations that people might not so readily have. What do you think? Getting and sharing credit. It's the #1 issue that brings people into Howard's office. And so we will often say how important it is to talk about authorship early and often during a project. How many people think that's a good idea? Wow, that's pretty good. How many people don't? How many people do it, talk about it really early? Well, a pretty good number of hands. So a lot of people actually will push back and say, how can we talk about authorship when all the work hasn't been done yet? We think it should be pretty easy. You continue talking about the work, where it's going. You talk about what are the criteria for authorship, and authorship will sort of evolve over time. But with clear criteria, it should be clear who will be the first, second, last, etc. author by the end. But again, we really encourage people to talk about it. In team setting, what happens if there's a disagreement? We really advocate that people talk about how they're going to manage disagreement early. The time to talk about how you're going to manage conflict is before there's conflict. Because as soon as there is conflict and you try to talk about how to manage it, you're going to assume I have an ulterior motive. And we're not going to be able to have a real successful conversation. This is a quote that, it's in quotes because somebody actually said it to me, but I've heard it from people all the way from very, very senior leadership all the way to postdocs. And it's basically, Michelle, it's not the science you need to worry about, it's the team dynamics that gets in the way. And so that's a lot of what I've been trying to kind of share with you over the last hour, is that really being able to tend to have the self-awareness, to have the other awareness, to know, kind of have a sense of what's going on in the group can really contribute to the science going a lot smoother. The last thing I guess another thing I wanted to mention is that one of the things I've spent a bit of time doing over the last year is actually working with some organizations to help launch teams. And I'm not going to go, I've got a couple of slides, but since time's sort of starting to run out, I won't go into it in detail. But really, there are some steps that organizations can go through if they're really interested in launching teams. That there's some steps you can go through to help not only get people up to speed, but I think I mentioned this in maybe two of the conversations yesterday, that the organization also has a commitment to the team, and that is to help them function well. And I really think it's important to give those teams some support in the terms of administrative support. So to leave it just in the hands of the scientists to find a next room for the meeting or to do a doodle poll to figure out when everybody's available, I mean, again, that can pull away from their science. So there's a nice way, I think, of being able to support, and that is, again, giving some administrative help. So I've got a bunch of other slides, but again, time is going short. I've got a whole thing on recognition and reward, because I think it's important to think about the recognition and reward in the context of the organization for doing team science and collaboration. But I won't go into that in a lot of detail, except for to just kind of put a bug in your ear that if you are ever in a situation where you hear the leadership say that we value team science and collaboration, we want to see you collaborate, but you don't see the reward structure associated with that, or the reward structure actually doesn't seem to exist or take team science into account, those are the times to start having conversations with supervisors, mentors, department chairs, because they should align. And if they want you to do team science and be collaborative, you should be recognized and rewarded for it. Again, my slides are freely available. There's a bunch of tools out there for team science and collaboration. The NCI created this team science toolkit. It's full of publications and assessments and all different things that you could use to support team science. There is a whole team science primer, how to do team science from a number of different perspectives, that was done by the CTSA at Northwestern University, and you can go in and be the PI, or you can go in and be the administrator for a grant. There's a collaboration success wizard. There's the toolbox project, which gets people talking about some of their philosophical differences as they come together and managing some of those. This is just a quote from a book by Peter Senge from The Fifth Discipline about the power of working in a really great team. So who here has worked on a team that was just a blast, had a great time? So a lot of times, once you've had that opportunity, you look to recreate that in other parts of your work. It's very, very satisfying, very, very fun. And I don't have a slide on fun, but I probably should, because really that's what it's all about, incredibly satisfying. So I think just because time's short, I'll just end here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to spend part of the morning with you, and there's a couple questions, we could do that too. So international collaborations have added dimensions of complexity, right? You've got different languages, and you really have different cultures, right? So you have different groups will have different perspectives about what it's appropriate to say, when it's appropriate to say it, how they view the individual versus the collective. And so I guess my advice would be, or I guess what I would say is that I would want to try to learn as much about those cultures as possible to make sure that everybody is aware of what some of the norms are in each of the cultures, but that together that you can start to kind of create the norms for your group, but in the context of that respect. You also have time zones and other things that you need to contend with.
Well, I've noticed in our meetings, our meetings when we get together that
Absolutely, and I've actually had people comment to me that even in an email context that they have seen people explicitly put English is my second language in their, kind of at the bottom of their emails, because people can sometimes misunderstand the kind of not perfect English as, and question the individual because of that. But once that's made explicit, people kind of give it a little bit more understanding. So you bring up some really good points. Thank you. Yeah. So you're asking, how do you get them to see that it's a collaboration, not a competition? I think, I guess I would think very carefully about how you present the project, how you convey to them what the ultimate goals are, how you share with them what the expectations are along the way, how they'll be functioning as a group, how they'll be evaluated, what's in it for them at the end. So I guess without knowing too much about what's happened in the past and knowing much about the culture that surrounds them, you know, sometimes it helps to be just very explicit. And so if what they're used to seeing is a very competitive type of a culture, then to be very explicit and say, I know that typically in this environment you tend to see things as being more competitive with these types of outcomes. Well, this type of activity is going to be different from that, and this is how it's different, and this is how we've got it set up. I don't know if that's helpful, but again, I think sometimes we make assumptions, right? And so when we share something with somebody or we try to entice somebody in it, from our perspective it seems really obvious. But if they're not seeing it clearly or seeing the what's in it for me or seeing the how it really is distinct from something else, it might be hard to encourage them to give it a try. Yeah?
How do you change this?
I can't change anything, right? All I can do is share information, ask some, you know, I think usually my approach when I have an opportunity to really talk to people is ask them questions. What's really important to you? Is mentoring important to you? Is supporting junior colleagues important to you? Trying to get a sense of where they are. There are some people who will never give up a senior authorship or a last authorship. There are some people who will never send a postdoc to give a talk in their place. You know, I think being aware of the motivations of these individuals and then thinking kind of carefully about, you know, I can't change that. I mean, they have to want to change. There's this great joke. It was, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb's got to want to change. And that joke has stayed with me for like 3 or 4 decades because you know, the best I can do is kind of share information. And one would hope that in the environment would recognize and reward people, especially at more senior levels, for stepping back and away, for ceding that last authorship position and folding into the second, for giving junior investigators a colleague. An opportunity, for serving more as a sponsor, right? So we talk about mentorship, and mentorship's important, but sponsorship is so much more important. Helping the postdocs, the graduate students network, giving them opportunities to present in their place, to go to regional meetings, et cetera, et cetera. So, sorry that was long-winded, but tell some of my passions coming out. Yeah. So I think what I would say is that it depends on what the goal of the team is. So if the team is very clear on its goal and has clear outcomes, then the team might come to a logical end. But does that mean that the team can't sort of transform into something else and kind of keep going at some level? Absolutely they could do that. I think the one piece of data or information that I have that I can share is that the team, if you don't change the membership of the team, the innovation, the creativity of that team is going to start to wane. So the best thing you can do for a team is to keep it fresh. Keep inviting new people in. Shake it up a little bit. Get some disruptors in there to help the team think differently, who can help the innovation go. And so, as you mentioned, you could have teams that end up persisting because you get some new people in there, you get the infusion of new ideas. Some people might drop away, some new people might come. So the name of the team might be the same, but the composition might be different 2 decades later.
So in the event of time, Dr. Bennett has to leave a little early today, so she won't make it for our awards ceremony.
Oh.
So on behalf of the West Virginia University and University of Pittsburgh and Duquesne student chapters of APS,
Oh
we
my
would like to
gosh.
present you with this award as a very gracious thank
Oh,
you.
thank you
for
so
being here.
much. Let me give you a hug. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
That's really nice. Thank you. Thank
very
you all
honored
very
that
much.
you
Oh,
took the
thank
time
you.
and effort to be
Oh, it was my pleasure. It was really wonderful to be here. It's been a fun visit, and I hope when you go home tonight you remember forming, storming, norming, and performing. Thank you.
So